to Inside Personal Growth Podcast. Deep dive with us as we unlock the secrets to personal development, empowering you to thrive. Here, growth isn't just a goal, it's a journey. Tune in, transform, and take your life to the next level by listening to just one of our podcasts. Well, welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. Hey, Ken, it's a pleasure having you and joining us today from New York. We have Ken Banta on the line, and Ken is the CEO of the Vanguard Network. But we're going to be talking about his new book, and you can hold it up there if you've got a copy.
Absolutely.
Called Seeing Around Corners, C-Suite Wisdom from America's Most Insightful Leaders. So there you go. Well, Ken, again, thank you for taking this time to talk with our listeners about your book. I'm going to let the listeners know a tad bit about you. He's spent decades of time in building the experience in executive suite, having aided 11 global turnarounds, mergers, and transformations for major corporations, including Bosch and Lomb. This is his latest work, Seeing Around Corners. It represents a remarkable collection of insights that were drawn from hundreds of hours of one-on-one interviews and exclusive high-performance leadership seminars. It's a post-Hill book. We'll put a link to it. If you look at the button below here on this video, you can press on it and I'll go right to Amazon to the book. The book is really quite unique in its structure. It's 16 quote-filled chapters that provide 360-degree of the challenges facing today's business leaders. And believe me, there's more and more of them that we're facing all the time, Ken, and I'm sure you're aware. The approach is really refreshing and practical, and he views leadership development not as an abstract theory, but as a discipline built on real-world experience and proven insights. So, Ken, thanks and welcome to the show. You can look Ken up. Well, again, I'm going to tell my listeners, go to the bottom here. We'll have links to his website. We'll have links to his LinkedIn so that you can get to Ken. So, Ken, you don't just show up and start a company like you have and do the kind of work that you're doing with executives with some level of background. And I said you had turnarounds in your experience. How did you get here? And why did you want to bring this book out now? Why do you believe it's so important that leaders get this kind of information?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me on with you. This is terrific experience. I guess going back in time, I actually started out way back growing up in Europe. So I was actually born in Germany with American parents, and then over time lived in Germany and Italy. I went to college in the US. I went to university at the University of Oxford in England. I was a Rhodes Scholar there. I then ultimately went to work with Time Magazine for about a decade as a foreign correspondent, and then embarked on a career of corporate turnarounds and transformations, which was really quite a turn from journalism, to be sure. And I think, though, that looking back, all those different experiences gave me a lot of opportunities and capabilities, and the journalistic one in particular, to really look at things in a fresh way, to be able to assess situations quickly, and to also be able to draw quick conclusions about what we need to do. And those capabilities turned out to be really valuable in the corporate world I was in, because where I went was not a typical stable environment, but more companies that were in serious trouble. And so I worked with a similar team of people for almost 15 years on a sequence of train wreck companies. And it's a great way of learning how to make change happen quickly, because you don't have time for it to happen slowly. And so I think a lot of my experiences from the past actually turned out to be quite useful for those tasks. And over those years, I especially learned a lot about the role of leadership in driving change, and also how to transform organizations from lower performance to higher performance. And jumping to the present in this book, In the past 8 or 9 years, I've been running a group called the Vanguard Network, and we really seek to apply some of those same lessons about change and leadership roles that I experienced in the corporate world, but doing it with a bunch of members of these networks that we've created of senior people. And all of those experiences really came to be distilled in this book, Seeing Around Corners. Um, Good question. Why now? I think really just a matter of serendipity. I think it's because we've had so many people in our organizations saying, "Wouldn't it be great to distill some of that learning and knowledge that they've heard in the various situations that we've created? Wouldn't that be useful for others as well?" So finally, we pulled the trigger on developing this probably a little less than a year ago, and like you said, I think it's a somewhat unusual book in that it's not a bunch of chapters that are kind of didactic and telling you what you need to do. They're much more distilling the insights of people who have been in some very, very interesting situations as leaders and taking their insights and bringing them to a much wider audience. The other thing I think we've hopefully
Think
achieved
it's
is a book
I
easy to
think
read.
it's good, Ken, not to interrupt you, but the
Yep.
reality is you interviewed all these people, but you also have this professional group, which is the Vanguard Network, where all of these leaders come. So you had them at your kind of disposal. I have a question for you though. Look, you said these very dysfunctional companies that you worked in, you had to be able to figure out things quickly. Why is it that most change management initiatives fail?
I think they fail because they don't really enlist the people at the working level in the change process. And so they often are uh, sort of pro forma efforts that look great on paper, but they don't really engage the people who matter. And, it's sort of human nature to go for the things that are easier to do. So it's always easier to put together charts and diagrams and flow charts around how a merger ought to occur. It's a lot harder to convey the right behaviors and the right way of thinking to put teams together. And especially when it's mergers and integrations, but, almost any change activity, people tend to get very tribal. They tend to see it as us and them. And so one of the challenges is how do you get people to see it as kind of we and we? How do you create a sense of unity instead of opposition?
Or
And one of those things.
or just a
Yeah.
we period, in other
Yeah,
words,
exactly.
I think that Richard Barrett's work is phenomenal, and I was trained in that. And you look at you go back to kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or you go back to who is a leader serving, right? In other words, the ever a Greenleaf, right? So, and I think that those are important. And I think in your book, the title is, we were talking about Rita McGrath, same
Mhm.
kind of title. But you're somebody who's had to see around corners pretty much all the time when you were in these shipwreck of companies, is what you said. Um, can you share a specific moment in your career when you wish you had seen around a corner that blindsided you, and what this taught you about your own leadership skills?
Well, a good there are a lot of examples of where I didn't see around corners, but probably one that was important, but at the end worked out pretty well is I was involved in the merger of a company called Pharmacia Corporation of Sweden and the Upjohn Company of the U.S., which back in the day was the leading American pharmaceutical company, but it had fallen on hard times because it didn't have a great pipeline and it had some other issues. So anyway, these two companies came together and what I didn't realize initially was the full degree of cultural differences between the two organizations that were on several levels. One of them was business culture, so the way they did things was different, but they were also different national and local cultures. And so, you had the Upjohn Company of Kalamazoo, Michigan, with all of those qualities,
Yeah.
and you had Pharmacia Corporation of Sweden. And what I didn't fully appreciate is the degree to which those differences were really kind of deeply ingrained and also caused tremendous amounts of friction. So it took some time, and I worked together with a new and incoming CEO on this to do what we were talking about earlier, which was how do you create that tribalism into more of a unified approach? And several ways we went at it, but, one of the most important was to just unify people around a bigger issue. And so, the bigger issue was if we didn't pull together, as they say, if we didn't hang together, we were going to hang separately. This merger was going to go down the drain. And I think we managed to convince people that they had to set aside these internal differences in order to have the company survive and for them to survive in the company. But it took a lot of work.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned a name, and I'm gonna relate back because just prior to you coming on this podcast, I was speaking with Meredith Parfait, and the
Mhm.
family that owned, Upjohn
Sure.
was Parfait family, and I'm very good friends with Bo and his father, who has a company in Michigan, and so the reality is that I know the story, so, um, it was just serendipitous that I literally hung up from a call from
Mm.
Bo's wife, prior to us getting on. Now, look, the Vanguard Network, you founded this and you said unfettered exchange of ideas through talking, listening, and sharing, no PowerPoints allowed. And we all live in this such a digital age now. Everything's on, you got AI, you got all this stuff happening. So, why do you think these simple human interactions have become so rare and so powerful? I think I know the answer, but I'm going to let you give me the answer.
Well, I think it does depend a bit on what group it is we're talking about. And it may be that for people at a different level in an organization, it might work better to have conferences and people presenting topics as a speaker. But I think when we're looking at people who are CEOs or C suite level individuals, which are most of our members, I think this group is really actually eager for something very different, which is a kind of peer to peer discussion around leadership topics. And it's not that they're just shooting the breeze. I think they're learning from each other about situations. They're hearing how someone else solved a very complicated, difficult problem, say with their board or with people they work with or with the external environment. And so I think that aspect of it is very important. You can't do that in a conference or a speaker-driven event. The other thing, that I think is really valuable is the networking that they are able to achieve, and, it's possible to do that at a big event and, gather around the proverbial water cooler and talk to people, but really we make the entire event about talking to people, so, they're sitting at small tables or virtual rooms if it's a digital discussion, and they're basically talking with each other for 45 minutes or for a half day, and I think, it sounds very simple, but, it's not that simple to make it happen, and on the other hand, it's not that often that it occurs.
Well, what you're doing is you're building community. And then I would assume that these same people are coming back again and again and again. So they're also building friendships. And one of the things is that, in today's world of loneliness, great, we can all get on a podcast, or we can go do a PowerPoint, or we can do this, or we can do that. But when do we actually break bread with somebody and become a friend? And then if you really needed something, somebody would be there. That's a true community, and I would say the way that the Vanguard Network is designed is to truly build true community, which is the kind of community that I'm talking about. Would that be an observation? I'd be correct?
Yeah, pretty much, I mean, whether they become friends or very good colleagues, I guess, is just a matter of semantics maybe, but, what happens for sure is that after a period of, time, I think these individuals become pretty comfortable picking up the phone, or the Zoom after these meetings and checking in to talk about stuff, and, we've had a number of situations where, one person was leading a role, and they basically identified their successor by through sitting next to them at dinner at one of our events, saved everyone a lot of time and effort. There's also lots of examples where people really decided to work through a problem that they had in their role during the course of one of the sessions that we have with the people at their table, and we actually have a session sometimes called Solve My Problem. And very interesting approach where we get people sitting next to each other to spend 10 to 15 minutes talking about a problem that's on their mind with the person next to them, and then get a little bit of feedback and then hear from that individual what they would do in this situation, and then turn tables and do the same thing. Very simple technique, but it allows people to, as you can imagine, really learn a concrete step forward, and at the same time develop a relationship with somebody maybe you don't know that well.
That goes back to the old Native American tradition when you pass the talking stick. Let the
Yeah,
stick go
very similar.
around and let people talk. And the reality is that's when you can relate and relate back to them what they heard. And then if you're asking for a solution, hopefully find a solution. Sometimes you just want to talk about the problem.
Yep,
We talk about guys always trying to solve our wives' problems, and they said they weren't looking for a solution. They just wanted somebody to hear them.
yep.
I think that part is so true, and I think sometimes people just need to be heard because it's lonely at the top, and they do want to talk to somebody about what's going on. And this brings me to this question. You said you write that strategy is somewhat overrated, that having a 3-year strategy can be meaningless in today's world. Well, we're seeing that now. Yes. How should leaders balance long-term vision with the agility needed for rapid change? I just had a gentleman who wrote book on innovation. He's a professor at Michigan, University of Michigan, and he said, "Look, if today and under our environment, both economically, politically, educationally, things that are happening, if you can't learn to live in ambiguity, you're going to have a really big challenge." And in our times, while all of these institutions are being shaken up, there is no new form yet. So that ambiguity is that form. Would you agree with this professor's statement?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, in terms of that situation of what do you do about strategy these days, I do think not that strategy isn't important in certain ways, but I think it's sometimes been overrated as something that people need to spend a lot of time on. And as you know, there are some corporations that have entire strategy departments that work on strategy year round. And I'm not sure that that's always necessary, perhaps. I think what's more important is have a clear sense of where you're going, and then being able to adapt and change uh, quickly as you move through the world toward that goal. And that's different than having a very structured strategy. It's more having a set of approaches to problems, which is a different way of thinking. And I also have found in my own experience that the people who often know the most about what you need to do and where you need to be going, and in fact, how you see around corners to get there, are the people who are at the working level because they're the ones who are in touch with the customers. They're the people who are in touch with reality. They're the ones who are in touch with the manufacturing work. And, these are pretty smart people, and they have usually very, very important insights on the way things really are. There's a book by Ram Charan, well, he's a strategy, but really a kind of directional guru called Confronting Reality. And, I think there's probably nothing more important than truly confronting reality, meaning understanding what the true state of things is and also how it's changing. And those people at the front lines often know more about that than anyone else. Again, during many of these, in fact, all of these turnarounds and transformations that I was involved in, we made a point of talking directly with the salespeople and the people in manufacturing and the other people at the front lines to get their advice about what's going on and what's needed. Had two effects. One is you learn a lot, and secondly, they start to have a lot more respect for leadership because they're being asked.
And they're being heard.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
That's, I think, this interaction that needs to occur, like what you're doing inside your group. Now, the one of the things that you discuss is the importance of realistic optimism versus blind optimism in the book. How can leaders cultivate this balance, especially when they need to inspire confidence during uncertain times? We're talking about people. I was listening to some of the stories on the news. How do I even predict my shipments or my raw materials at this particular point? Because I don't know if I can get those raw materials to make this product that I'm making into the future. I mean, that's a real problem. And 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 the question is, am I going to find alternative sources in other countries to be able to get these materials and all that kind of stuff? It really comes down to somebody working through all of the things they can do, but also having someone else they can share it with, right? To talk about it and say, well, what are you guys doing? Or what have you found? Or is there a resource, right?
Yeah, so I think, at the higher levels of leadership, it's remarkable how little interaction of that kind people sometimes have. So we find that these interactions that we create are really valuable for that reason. You would think that a CEO spends all their time out there talking with fascinating people and learning about which directions to go that they hadn't thought about. But the reality is they're spending an awful lot of their time with the board. They're spending a lot of the time with the accounting firm. They're spending a lot of time with their own team. They're dealing with internal problems, and then they go home. And so the opportunity they have to interact with peers is actually a lot more limited than you might think. So we find that the Vanguard forums and other networking activities that we carry out are really important for that purpose. Um, it's also, though, I think, very important in very complex, chaotic times like today, uh, for your strategy in some ways to be execution, meaning that you don't spend too much time worrying about, following a particular strategy. Your strategy is to execute around the immediate problems. And the other quality that I think is really important is, where qualities are agility and adaptability, because those themselves, in a sense, become your strategy. You don't know exactly where things are going, but you've got to have a team and a mindset that is ready to pivot and to adapt and to change. And that's hard to that's hard to instill in a very big organization. Big organizations tend to be like, aircraft carriers. They tend to be moving, in one direction. It takes them a mile to stop. But the challenge for a leader in a place like that is to really turn this kind of organization into much more of a fighter pilot type mentality.
Very, very good point you make. And that, you know, brings me to this question. You have a section under like crisis decision making where you've asked questions, and the book covers 8 stages of crisis extensively. Now, you could say that some companies today are experiencing this crisis. They can't get their materials, they can't ship on time, they've got issues even getting things in from, let's say, China or other places. When you're advising executives in a crisis mode, which you've done it many times, what's the single most important thing they need to remember when everything really kind of feels out of control? I mean, once you do it, it's almost like a dominoes effect. It's like, okay, one thing went, the next thing went, the next thing went, the next thing's right. And you see a whole supply chain just going down the tubes. And you're saying, what am I going to do?
Well, I think if you are the senior person in the room, probably your most important role is to stay calm, which is kind of hard to do when everything is piling up around you. But really, that that quality then enables other people to steady themselves and start to think through how to be agile, how to adapt to a situation. Whereas if people are in a state of hysteria, which is really what often happens in a crisis, you really do start to lose control of your story. And so I do think that one of the most important things that a leader can do is to bring that aura of calm. And the way you do that is not by what you say, but how you behave. So it's a matter of simply collecting yourself and having, what's called executive presence, being able to demonstrate that you don't know any more than anyone else does in the room, but you're confident that in the right way this team can make it. And that's perhaps sometimes that's the distinguishing factor between really good leaders and not so good leaders is all those things become more visible in a crisis. And I think it's the great leaders who are able to summon that kind of sense of calm in the midst of chaos.
Well, and that reminds me a lot of, what when there's a triage kind of situation, right? People are saying, okay, we're going to leave these people because they're going to die anyway, and we're going to go on and move with the ones that we can pull from the wreckage, whatever it might be, or the earthquake, or whatever. And one of your contributors mentioned that. says if you don't make the decision, you have made the decision, right? And I think decision making in times like this is such an important role that they play. How do you coach leaders who are paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong decision? Because anybody could enter that situation in triage and go, oh, darn, I could have saved that person, or I could have saved that person, or maybe, but they went and had to make a decision to pass by somebody. That's got to be pretty tough to do, really.
Well,
Mhm.
I think, for starters, fortunately, most corporate crises are not as dire as that in
I,
terms.
I get it. I used it as an
Uh,
extreme
but it
example,
but
but
it's an extreme example.
yeah.
But the reason that I think, it's in most situations, I think the best advice is to not be paralyzed by the need to make the best decision and instead to make a decision, which is kind of what you were just saying, and that it's okay to make mistakes. I think that, for example, in the current environment of disruption at best and chaos, perhaps is really what's going on with the markets and world trade and other factors. One response is to just wait and see, and that's an easy decision to make. It's probably not the best one. Most of the time, the best idea is to keep acting with the knowledge you have at hand because it'll help you continue to keep moving forward. You'll probably make some mistakes, but you've got to get used to that. Perfection is the enemy of movement, really. So that's probably the most important thing I think to bear in mind as a leader, that you're not going to get judged negatively on making some mistakes, but you'll probably get judged pretty harshly if you do nothing.
That question and your answer brought me back to a memory of me working with a gentleman by the name of Larry Wilson Learning. He was out of Minnesota. You might remember Larry. And when we would do workshops with people, we'd have this game and the board would light up and there'd be two teams, right? And it was really about, and the countdown would occur on one side. You'd have $1 million and it would start to go down. And it was really about how quickly people could make a decision versus being frozen, right? And what they found is when you put your foot on the squares and the buzzer went off, right? It was like, oh, now I know where the landmine is, but I needed to find the landmine before I could actually get to the other side and all my money ran down, right? And I
Mhm.
thought it was just such an exceptional game because it taught not being afraid to make the decision to step on the landmine so that you could see where the landmine was, so you could chart a path across that. Um, and your book discusses failing fast with projects, but being slow and conscientious with people and culture. How do leaders navigate the paradox in practice? Because what I just said, it's certainly not contrary, but it is about failing fast.
So, one of the people we work with very closely is a guy named Benjamin Bargetzi, who is a interesting combination of psychologist and business leader and coach and advisor out of Switzerland. And Benjamin has a lot of insights about neurology and behavioral psychology around, why we do what we do, and also certain things that are inherited from our distant past that sometimes are not a great asset. And one of them is the tendency to run from problems, right? You have it goes back to when there was a dinosaur in your life an animal that might eat you, and so the instinctive thing is to run from danger. But in reality, what you need to do today is to on one hand, realize that you need to fail quickly around a particular problem personally, not run from it, but confront it. And then the other thing is to also slow down and think about certain things and give them time. And those are tendencies that are probably contrary to our kind of inherited genetic makeup. And so
Right.
I guess what Ben's saying is that you can achieve a lot by having a greater understanding of some of these underlying factors in your makeup so that you can respond to them in an effective way. It's kind of an area of, in the world of psychology of self-awareness, and when you're aware of how you're wired, you'll be able to respond better. So my own feeling is that CEOs and other leaders would probably do well to spend a lot more time learning about neurology and human psychology because it'll help them understand themselves better, and it'll help them for sure understand the people around them better as leaders.
Yeah, and the whole concept we just talked about is a built-in, neural pathway that's usually pretty strong in most people, and it's the fight or flight. So the reality is that, people will say, "Okay, I'm gonna fight," right? Or, "I'm gonna flee. I'm gonna run the other direction from this." And that is a hardwiring in most human beings, right? To as a protection mechanism. Um, so look, we have entered a whole new era here now. And this hasn't been that long, but it's been explosive, and it's the AI era. And technology is AI being disruption. You talk about disruption in the book. Um, what human leadership qualities do you believe will become even more valuable in this next decade to come, especially with AI as it's continuing and now AGI, to actually exponentially have a huge effect on our productivity, on a workforce that many now could be released from? Where do you stand with all this, and what are the people at the Vanguard group saying about all this?
Well, I think first of all, no one really knows, right? It's
Right.
we're right in the midst of the transformation, and it's like I'm sure people who were in the midst of the beginning of the industrial age had no idea really what was happening for the long term. They just saw what was going on around them. But that said, I think it's got some analogies. AI is a terrific tool. I think it's going to free people up in many ways to spend time on even more creative things like how to utilize AI or how to refine something that comes out of AI. It may well displace people from tasks like, let's say, market research, where previously you had a team of people who were doing nothing but delving into past experience or what other brands have been doing, and now you can unleash AI on that same question and get the answer very quickly. But I think the jury's out as to whether this means that all these people are going to be permanently displaced from work or they're going to be displaced from this to take on something new. And, when you think back to the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of hardship and disruption that was caused for sure, as the transition occurred between, agricultural and rural economies to industrial economies. On the other hand, a lot of people ended up finding that they had uh, jobs and work that was possibly more fulfilling, or at least not any less fulfilling than what they were doing before. It did, however, come together with problems of urban life and crime and poverty. So a mixed picture, but I don't think the world ended with the Industrial Revolution. I think it evolved. And so I'm imagining with AI that we're just going to see an evolution of how society operates and what people do day to day. It might be that we'll have what some people predict, which is a kind of vast age of, non-work activity that, you and I are going to be released to spend time at a pool, reading a book. I don't know. I mean, I have a feeling that for people who want to be doing stuff, there'll still be plenty to do, but it's going to be very different. So, there's always I guess if the only thing that makes me think that's likely is you look back through history and every really transformational moment in history was greeted at the time as a catastrophe, and then things carried on, and human life evolved in a kind of new way, but it evolved.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I don't think this is gonna be catastrophic. I know some people fear it. They think it's gonna,
Yeah.
like, take over. Um, I think we'll work hand in hand with AI and robots and all kinds of things that we don't see today. I mean, look at our military today between Ukraine and Russia and the amount of drones that are being used to actually fight. We didn't. You and I grew up in era there weren't drones. Nobody knew what the hell a drone was. We didn't have an idea. But every area of technology has a new way of making things evolve. Now, in that case, my example, hopefully less lives will be lost as a result of using drones, but the reality is it is what it is. So look, Ken, you've facilitated hundreds of these exchanges with top executives. And I think our listeners might want to know what's the most surprising or counterintuitive insight about leadership that's emerged from the conversations that you've had. Obviously, this is about seeing around corners. So you've probably got several you could report on, but give us two or three things you think you see around corners today that a leader listening right now off of LinkedIn would want to take note of and potentially start doing something about.
Yeah, so one example certainly is looking into the future, and there's a big industry out there of modeling future events and thinking about what'll happen. And what was instructive to me is that in a similar sort of exchange that we actually conducted back when I was at one of the companies I was in, Sharing Plow, we had a futurologist come in and talk with us, and he said, "I'll tell you something that is sort of contrary to my profession." He said, which is that almost anything you are told is a future prediction and where things are going to go based on sort of what we know today is almost always going to be wrong. And he gave as an example the period prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I happened to cover as a journalist when I was at Time Magazine. Up to that point, no one was predicting this. They were predicting an endless Cold War. They were predicting all kinds of, spin-off problems from a Cold War. No one was predicting the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of Eastern Europe, and the rise of what turned out to be jihadist groups in the Middle East. It was not predicted by anyone. So his point was, as a top leader, when you hear people telling you about where things are heading, be aware that very likely the right answer is different. And so that kind of leads to the seeing around corners element, which is to not take conventional wisdom at face value very often because it's almost always going to be wrong. So I think that's one important element. I'd say another comes back to where to look for insight, and it's sort of bit assumed wisdom that the leadership team around you is going to give you real insights into the organization. They're going to be, sort of the right people to go to for thinking through future strategy. But the problem with the people around you, typically, even when you do your best to avoid this, is that there's a kind of group think element. And
Right.
there's also, if you're the leader, a tendency to tell you what you want to hear or to hear from them what you've told them. And so you end up in an echo chamber. And so I think another big learning is to get outside of that echo chamber. It's not that the leadership team around you isn't valuable. It's simply that when it comes to fresh thinking, to again being able to see around corners, to be able to decide where to take things, you really need to listen to others. It might be people several levels down in your organization, or to our discussion here, it may be talking to peers in other organizations who can speak freely with you and share honest opinions about things and bring fresh points of view to your attention, not necessarily about the state of the world, but perhaps how to work with your board or how to understand yourself better. And those are rarely insights that you're going to gain from the people who work for you directly. So those are at least two good examples.
It's a good one. I remember a quote recently from Sarah MacArthur, who works with Marshall Goldsmith, and they co-authored a book with who's the guy that used to run Boeing and then Ford. He was involved in it as well.
Oh,
And Magali,
yeah, Malai.
Malali, and Frances Hesselblom, the gal that ran, the leader that ran the Girl Scouts and grew it into 750,000 basic volunteers. She used to be good friends with Peter Drucker. And this quote sat in my mind because Drucker said to her, and this was a throwaway quote with an interviewer, and it was, "When you look out the window, what is it that you see that I don't see that you could actually make a difference and change?" Something to that effect, right?
Mhm.
When you look out the window, when you see around the corner, when you do the kind of things it is, what is it that you think you could do about that problem or that issue, right? And I think Drucker at the time was just like he just, made it up. It became kind of a pretty famous quote because then Frances was using it all the time. And she'd say that every time someone would come to sit down with her, that's the first question she'd ask them.
Mhm.
And I think those thought provoking questions that you ask at the Vanguard Network are really important. And I think that is what stimulates conversation for people to think out of the box, to actually be looking around the corners. So if you were to sit down with your younger self when you
Mhm.
started the Vanguard Network, what piece of wisdom from the book would you share and why? What would it be, Ken? Because you've seen everything. You've been with hundreds of CEOs, done turnarounds. You're a reporter. Very interesting background and how you got here. If you were to look at all that DNA and put it all together, say, here's the one thing that I could say that I think could help our listeners today that they could take away, what would that be?
Well, I mean, it's hard to distill all these things into one thing, but at least one thing out of a number of things that I would identify that is quite an important nuance, but I think it's really important is that, people talk all the time about how you need to have trust in people and we have to be granted trust, or you have to gain trust of people. And I think that the really important insight that one of the CEOs I worked with, Fred Hassan, uh, delivered was it's not about getting trust or deserving trust, it's earning trust. And the insight on earning trust is that you don't gain trust until you've earned it. So, for example, there are often people in a management team who say, "Well, you ought to trust me to do things because I have a certain role. I'm the vice president of this or the executive vice president of that." And the point there is that you still have to earn trust to be trusted. So until that happens, the CEO or someone else is going to be watching very closely, and they may well do things that you feel are second guessing you because they're not yet convinced that you've earned their trust. But once you have, they'll treat you that way. But it's a really important distinction because a lot of organizations, I think, end up going in the wrong direction because people just assume that they should have trust or they should be trusted to do things, and off they go. So it's an interesting one, and the same goes for a CEO in relation to a board. A lot of CEOs, I think, believe that the board should trust them automatically and give them leeway. But probably wiser decision to say, "I'm gonna earn your trust, and when I have, then you'll wanna let me go my own way because I'll be, on the same wavelength as you, and you'll know that I will do what I said." And how do you earn trust? We all know, or we ought to know the answer to that is really doing what you said.
That is a really important point you made around trust because as you were speaking, I was thinking, hey, I remember interviewing Stephen M.R. Covey for Trust and Inspire, and the title of the book is Trust and Inspire: How Truly Great Leaders Unleash Greatness in Others. And you're exactly right. It's around trust. As soon as you build that trust, you can actually build a basically a great leader, another great leader, which is what leaders should be wanting to do. They should be wanting to build other leaders within the company. So you bring up a really important point. Well, if you would, Ken, hold up the book. It's Seeing Around Corners, and it's Ken Banta. And as we said, we're going to have a link to that book below here. We'll also have a link to Ken's website, and it's the Vanguard Group. You can type it in, and you'll be able to get there and learn more about Ken. Um, Thank you for your time today, your wisdom, your thoughts, and your explanation of how people now could kind of position themselves more to work in these times of ambiguity and uncertainty and actually navigate through them successfully, and come out the other side a winner. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. This was great fun.
Enjoyed it. Take care, Ken.
Thank you.